And now on to the business of the day, and without further ado, I call to the podium the Chair of the day, Madeline McManus, to take over today's meeting. Thank you.
Good afternoon all. It is my distinct pleasure to be asked to be chair of this session for today. Optimism is pretty much the raison d'etre and why I do what I do in a whole range of things. So I'm delighted to introduce Victor Parton, who is the founder of the founder and Chief Optimism Officer. I have to get that right, Victor, for the Centre for Optimism, which he founded in 2019. Victor's background, he studied economics and law at Monash, Melbourne and Peking universities, and he has had a very distinguished and diverse career with more than 18 years experience as a parliamentarian, practice as a barrister. He's both a mediator, an arbitrator, a businessman, a private sector board service director and mentor. He's a former Commissioner of the Americas, promoting foreign direct investment in Victoria, supporting Victorian exporters, building the global supply chains, very important, and making sure that people are connecting through expat and alumni networks. His board experience includes the Yarra Valley Water, the Transport Actors Commission, the Global Integrity Summit, the Australian Centre for Financial Studies, and the patron of the Digital Leadership Institute. His current work includes advice on optimistic leadership, where we're going to hear lots about today, Australian leadership, integrity and strategy. Please think about what we're going to ask and have an animated discussion once Victor does his presentation. But in the meantime, please join me in warmly welcoming Victor to the stage.
Well, firstly, it's a thank you for that generous introduction, but it's also a thank you to Rotary. One of our activities at the Centre for Optimism is we are the major sponsor and soon to be the manager of the Nelson Mandela Youth Leadership Summit. And a number of Rotary clubs from Shepparton, from Carlton and elsewhere were absolutely at the centre, and your district governor spoke to the young people. So number one, it's a huge thank you. Number two, I'm actually speaking to an organisation that is innately optimistic. So the focus on my speech today is going to be on infectious optimism and putting the case for optimism, because what you've achieved in polio is quite remarkable. I think the last province or state of India that had polio recently declared itself to be polio-free. But I'm also inspired by what you're doing in your newest project, which is the anti-malaria campaign. Again, partnered with the Gates Foundation, but we have halved the malaria death rate this century as one of the conversations at our table. So 1,000 children will live today who would have died. And we are on the way, through the advances in vaccine production to potentially producing a vaccine against malaria. So again, it's something that you are right at the core of. Why am I doing what I do? I had the privilege of being Commissioner to the Americas, so working in San Francisco, office in New York, Washington, Chicago, and then we moved down into Latin America as well. And everywhere I went, my work was made easy by the stereotype of people like you as relentless optimists. But that is the world perception of Australians. And I still remember the chairman of Caterpillar, who I met in Peoria. Those of you in PR know that if it plays in Peoria, it plays anywhere. And he looked at me and he said, "You Aussies remind me of the Americans of 100 years ago. Nothing is impossible." The truck driver you meet on Route 66, I love that fustas of yours. It doesn't matter what part of American society, north or south, you go to, but there is this positive stereotype of Australians. After that, I served as senior advisor to the Australian G20 presidency. So the G20 being the most powerful economic body in the world today. And I worked for Joe Hockey first and then for Tony Abbott. And again, at that super elite level, it was exactly the same. Complete trust in us as Australians, absolutely positive attitude, and a trust. And then I came back to Melbourne in 2015, and I was astonished by the negativity. the negativity of language, the negativity towards leadership. Now, I had changed. You know, you live in San Francisco with flowers in what's left of your hair. You know, you drink optimism every day. Working on the G20 as a nomad, again, you know, I've been in utterly optimistic environments. But I couldn't understand this change in Australian language and attitudes. And so rather than complain about the complainers, we set up the Australian Leadership Project. We interviewed 2,500 people over 2 years, from Bill George at Harvard, through to the experts at INSEAD, through to people working on the factory floor. And we came to the conclusion that there are 3 qualities that distinguish an Australian leader from a global leader. You might not agree with all of them, but these are the 3 that the experts thought. Number 1, egalitarianism. We are through the roof for egalitarianism, you know, to treat the cleaner with the same respect as the chairman. Secondly, self-effacing humour. Yeah, we laugh at ourselves. Even in all of the presentations we've had today, there's been laughter and jokes against ourselves. And in some countries, it's a mental illness, you know, to self-effacing humour. But here it's compulsory. And then thirdly, no bullshit plain speaking. I had to look after the Russian finance minister 2 weeks after they blew up the plane over Ukraine back in 2013. And at the end of the year of the G20, he looked at me and said, "Victor, I never die wondering what you'll think." And that's a good thing. So at the end of like 2 years of study, we were still left bewildered as to why Australian language had become so negative and why attitudes to leadership were so negative. Now, I'm not talking about politics. I mean, you tell jokes about politicians, whether you're in Russia or China or Uzbekistan or Sydney. This was a much deeper antipathy towards leadership. And we're trying to work out whether it was language. Do Australians refer to their leaders as boss? You know, lead me to it, boss. You know, she'll be right, boss. But then my revelation came at the Global Integrity Summit in 2017. After 3 days of misery, and we've had Jeffrey Robinson, all those guys, you would have thought it was the end of press freedom, the end of human rights. And I changed my speech on the last panel to the case for optimism. And it electrified the room. And Helen Clark, the former New Zealand Prime Minister, said, "Victor, turn that into a book and I will endorse it." And I did, and she did. And that was the genesis of the Centre for Optimism. We believe the problem was not a problem of leadership. We think the problem is the fog of pessimism. And last week in Singapore, Senior Minister Tharman made a speech where he said the greatest public policy issue of today is the loss of optimism in the developed world. And it was not a Pollyanna speech, right? It was about, you know, we're in the poo on climate change. We're in the poo on Ukraine. As Singapore, you know, they're extremely worried about the standoff between China and the United States. So it wasn't a Pollyanna speech, but like me, he'd identified this as the largest public policy issue. And the World Economic Forum in January, in its global risk report, actually listed the loss of optimism as one of the 4 global risks, leading to disorder. You just have to look at London, you know, over the last few weeks. To know that it's not just true of countries in Central Africa, it's true of what's happening in the West. So let me first turn to optimism, because Robert had a very good question at our table on the difference between optimism and realism. So my favourite definition of optimism comes from an English mystic of the 14th century, Mother Julian of Norwich. Anyone here an Anglican or Catholic scholar? Indeed. Do you want to tell everyone who she was?
She was an eccentric woman, I think you call it today. She lived a solitary life in a communal setting.
That's right.
And stood out advice to those.
Absolutely. She was an anchorite. So she got sick, prayed to God that she would recover. She recovered, kept her promise. I think she came from a wealthy family because she had servants and the like, but her book is the oldest surviving book in English by a woman, called The Revelations. And in it there is one sentence: all shall be well, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. Now this has become the stuff of poetry. Oxford University just commissioned a new choral piece devoted to her. And so what she's saying is we're in the middle of the Black Plague, which made COVID look like a picnic. 30% of the European population were killed. Whole towns were killed. But all shall be well, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. And had she lived 700 years, she could have written the Harvard Medical School definition of optimism. A belief that good things will happen and that things will work out in the end. A belief that good things will happen and that things will work out in the end. Now, anyone here a John Lennon fan? What did John Lennon add as a response to that definition? John Lennon famously, amongst others, said, and if it hasn't worked out, it's not the end. I mean, that is a Rotarian view, isn't it? Now, why is it so important? Why do I want you to be able to articulate the case for optimism? The science has changed since most of us went to university. In 2018, Harvard University, Boston University, and the American military produced a report on healthy longevity, living to 85 in good physical and mental health. As you can imagine, the researchers thought it would be wealth or income, that it would be genetics or geography. But they were confounded when the trait most closely associated with healthy longevity is the trait of optimism. They were so confounded they actually didn't have a mechanism for it. Luckily enough for us, a number of universities took up the challenge, and the American Heart Association set up a global scientific panel, which concluded after 2 years of research, and I interviewed the chairman of the scientific panel, and the video's on our website if you need it. They concluded that optimism is the key protective trait against all of the major mortalities, against cancer, against heart disease, against dementia. In the latter, it slows down the onset, and it is the key predictor of recovery, right? So you have a heart event, you have cancer, the key predictor of you successfully going through treatment is the trait of optimism. Now, I give long speeches on this, and we've only got 20 minutes. So anyone who wants my 105-page PowerPoint, just write to victorparton@gmail.com and I will send it to you. Or there is my 500-page book which covers it as well. Secondly, on the scientific stuff, and we can talk about sleep or otherwise, but the most important one is relationships, isn't it? And there's a wonderful study out of Michigan University which says that those who've got an optimistic spouse have the same health effects as being optimistic yourself. So if you wake up to a smile, or you go to breakfast with a smile, or you go to bed with a smile, you're likely to have the same protective effect. So those of you who are married or partnered to an optimist, mazel tov. You don't have to listen to another word I say, just look out the window and fantasize about what you're going to do to them tonight. Those of you who've got a pessimistic spouse, there are 2 responses at the end of my speech, and one of them will be to niggle them to become a bit more optimistic. And for those of you who are single, the question I want you to remember is, what makes you optimistic? So on that first date, after you get through what will you drink, what will you eat, why are you so beautiful, why are you so handsome, ask them what makes them optimistic. And if they can't answer that question, the first date is the last date. Let's turn to the world of work, because many of you are in the business and government and beyond. I referred to it at the table earlier. Victor Parton, who is now the head of Rio Tinto, or the chairman of Rio Tinto, I interviewed him during the leadership study and asked him about leadership, positive leadership. And Dominic said to me, every great leader I have ever met is infectiously optimistic, but it's not the grand speech from the podium, right? It's not the big man or woman doing the rah-rah speech. Because for most people, optimism does not come from work. It does not come from the boss. We've interviewed 20,000 people. Less than 1% nominate government, the Prime Minister, their boss, or their work. So Victor Parton, in his wisdom, says what we need to do is uncover the optimism of our workforce to be able to harness it. And to give you an example, I did a job for a Victorian government department a few blocks down the road that is charged with getting people back into the centre for Melbourne. And they couldn't even get their own workforce back to the office. So we did, has anyone here used Teams instead of Zoom? It's horrible. But I had 25 people on Teams, and we went round the room asking them what makes you optimistic. And we got to the woman who said, my garden and my pets. And we're all thinking, she doesn't want to come back to the office. So I said, what are your pets? And she said, oh, a dachshund, a canary, and a rabbit. And I said, oh, does your rabbit live inside like ours does? She said, does yours watch television too? I said, mine not only watches television, she can switch off the remote control when Rick Stein gets to the rabbit recipes. Now, we all roared with laughter, but the boss got it. He said to me, I've never talked to her about her garden or her pets. Right? How do I harness her optimism when all I talk to her about is policy documents or outputs or inputs? So when you go back to the office or go home tonight, this is the question I want you to think about asking: what makes you optimistic? And the chances are that whoever you ask will have not been asked the question before. Have a think about doing it round the board table instead of that awful question that AICD promotes or KPMG sent out to me last week. What's keeping you awake at night? Now, all the married women in the room know that nothing keeps a husband awake at night. Ask that question, go around the board table. What makes you optimistic? What makes you optimistic about X? The second thing I'd like to do on work is strategy. So we've interviewed 400 of the world's leading strategists. 90% of them say that optimism should be the underpinning of good strategy. You want the organisation to be better at the end of the period than at the beginning. But the key is the optimistic inputs. You know, what are the scenarios you're being painted? You know, is climate change an existential threat or is it an opportunity? I'm on the board of a utility that will be carbon neutral by 2024, positive by 2025, just through some clever technology like waste to energy and some experiments in green hydrogen and the like. Innovation, right? Any of you employ people for innovation or do innovation yourself, you know that pessimists can't innovate. Why can't they innovate? Too much risk? They're too obsessed with negative risk rather than positive risk opportunity. They're also ground down by failure, right? Why did it go wrong? Who went wrong? I'm at fault. Dyson is my favourite example. Who's got a Dyson vacuum cleaner? Did anyone read the interview he did with The Australian on how many models of the Dyson vacuum cleaner he produced before he achieved commercial success? Do I get a bid? How many? Oh, you were close. 5,000. Now, you know, some of them were minor modifications, but it was 15 years of trial and error. He's a billionaire now. He's got innovation centres all around the world. But the key, as he says, to innovation is that underpinning trait of optimism. And the last one is resilience. You know, we were talking about all of the dikes we've built on the Murray River and elsewhere. We've spent billions on resilience. But as Jane Burns, the head of the Young and Well CRC, said, as the author of Man's Search for Meaning, the book about the Holocaust, says, you can't be resilient unless you're optimistic. What's the point of persisting if you don't believe that by persisting you are going to reach a better place? Now look, that's enough. In the 20 minutes I've got to be tight. So let me share 2 or 3 interventions that you can adopt in your own life that you can help others to be more infectiously optimistic. Now, the first one is what the Dalai Lama says. Smile and say hello to everyone. Right? Walking down Collins Street, walking round the block, leave no one unmolested with your smile and your look into the eyes. As the Dalai Lama said, and I was lucky enough to be in a small group with him earlier in the year, he said, look, I've got a religion that not that many people follow. I've got a country occupied by the Chinese. What do I think the key to my success is? It's smiling and saying hello to everyone. And you know, these days, you know, there's a lot of people with masks on. There are a lot of people with 2 ear pods in. If you walk around Faulkner Park, they don't even look at you. They're all reading their email. There I give it a go. I sort of wave at them, you know, hi, hello. But number one task I set for you all is what the Dalai Lama says. Just smile and say hello to everyone. Whether it's on the tram, the other day I was on the tram, I had the most interesting conversation with the architect for Twiggy Forest's new 10-kilometre conveyor belt. Never met him before in my life, right? It was a smile and hello on the tram. The second one is to laugh more, which you do in Rotary and we've already been doing. But is everyone here feeling brave and allowed to allow their inhibitions to go away today? Good, because we're going to end, after question time, we're going to do laughter yoga. Anyone here done laughter yoga before? No one ever puts their hand up when I ask that question, but we're going to do 30 seconds of hysterical laughter at the end of questions. The third one is change your greeting. So in Australia, one of the things that has happened in recent years is when you say hello or g'day to someone, how are you? What is the response you get? Busy, that's one, yeah, that's good. Fine, you've got to be in rare company. What's the most common Australian answer to not bad? And what's the worst one? Not too bad. And do we ever say, oh my God, what's wrong? Right, we ignore it. So you think, how many hundreds of conversations have you started with that? So what we did in prison, over 3 months, we got the prisoners to take away the question, how are you, and replace it with what's been the best thing in your day. Now you can imagine my best customer is a man with a fearsome black beard who had killed 5 people. And he looks into your eyes and says, what's been the best thing in your day? You know, answer it. It was so powerful in the prison, in changing the power balance between prisoners and the warders, we were asked to come back and train the general managers of prisons. Right? The cardiologists have had me speak in a number of conferences. The most powerful intervention is that one. So I'd like you to try it for 2 days. Right? If it doesn't work, come back to me. But I guarantee to you, if you do it for 2 days, you will find that 80% of your conversations start with a positive story. And I want you to remember this gesture. Next time you say, g'day, how are you? And someone says, not bad, you are going to say, oh my God, what a waste of a greeting. I was in a supermarket the other day and the bloke says, are you the one that told me to change my greeting? I said, yes, how's it going? So I haven't got time to listen to all those stories. So it works. The last one, and I think I'm reaching my time, as Dirty Harry says, a man has to know his limitations. The other one I'd like to suggest to you is around gratitude. Now, anyone here keep a gratitude journal? Please, do you want to tell them how you use it?
Well, it's a verbal journal.
Come around. Yeah.
Sorry.
Come up here.
So I'm Jewish, and there are a number of blessings you recite in the early morning. And the first one is, thanks for keeping me here alive. The next is, thanks for giving the birds and the cockerel the cognitive powers to distinguish day from night, etc. So by the end of walking the dogs around the oval, I feel pretty good.
Yeah, that's perfect. So that's, in fact, we've had a rabbi talk to us about that being, one of the strongest rabbinical practices. Stephen King, the horror writer, anyone a fan of horror movies? Stephen King every morning does his 5-minute gratitude meditation. The other way to do it, this comes back to those of you who've got a slightly pessimistic spouse, is to keep a journal by your bed or a pad by your bed. And when you remember it and you're heading to bed in your pajamas or nightie, just to scribble down the 3 best things in your day. And that could be quite trivial. My chicken dish was particularly good. The view was great. My daughter came to lunch with me. A whole lot of those sorts of things. But you just write down 3. And those of you who've got a slightly pessimistic spouse, at that point you'll say, oh, honey, do you want to share the best thing in your day? But the trick is exactly as you say. The scientific evidence says if that's the first thing you read in the morning, it will lift you for the whole day. And if you're sitting on the toilet first thing in the morning, you might even flick back a few pages and it brings great joy. And the other one is, of course, the thank you, as I started today. The more often you can say thank you, whether it's to the barista, you know, the waitress, the tram driver, whatever, the better you will feel, the better they will feel. We've got 14 Habits of the Optimist on an animated course. So those of you who just want to do a Google Habits of an Optimist, we ran it out for the British government during lockdown. One of the ministers who's recently been in the news said to me, that is the best hour I spent during lockdown. I said, surely your husband or your lover. She said, no, that wouldn't have taken an hour. So if you'd like to do that, that's on the line. Centre for Optimism is on Google too. And anyone who just, I'm Victor Parton at Gmail, feel free, whatever you need from me, to help to be more infectiously optimistic. And so now it's time for questions.
Thank you, Victor. That was excellent. Now, can I ask you, we've got lovely questions. We're going to ask you to stand up and identify who you are, please, and then we're going to sort of take them from there. So, sorry.
Congratulations, Victor. Great to reconnect with you. I'm an optimist. I barrack for Melbourne.
Yay! Yay!
But thinking about your talk today and not knowing just what you were going to deliver, and let me tell you, it was fantastic. I was reading the paper this morning, and as I turned the pages over, thinking about optimism, every headline had a negative tone. Every headline. Didn't matter what they were talking about. Of course, in the Herald Sun, they talked about the budget. There were 13 articles with negative headlines. They talked about the new Prime Minister in Great Britain. Negative headlines about the new Prime Minister. Hasn't even started yet. And then there was climate change, even electric vehicles. You can make anything you like negative. How do you become optimistic when you're confronted with that every morning in the news and probably on the news at night?
Yeah, and Bruce, you're old enough to have experienced the change in news media. So Steven Pinker, the head of Harvard Psychology, wrote a book called The Enlightenment. And in that book, his researchers tracked the change in the news from when you and I were young. So in the mid-70s, when Channel 7, 9, 2 only had 2 crews, they had to use videotape. Half the news was positive. You put out a press release as a businessman or a hospital or a research centre, there was a fair chance you'd get a run. Today, it's 95% bad. 95% bad. So those of you who wake up to an alarm, which is the news, you're going to start the day on the wrong foot. So what you've got to do is the gratitude practice to start with, right? Start the day not listening to the news. With CEOs, I say to them, don't listen to the news till you're driving into work or catching the bus to work. You have to reduce your news consumption, right? It will drive you nuts. So the way I do it, and someone was talking about social media, my Twitter's really positive. My Facebook stream is really positive because what I put out and what I tick with approval is immensely positive. But, you know, it's changing the world. You know, Australia, as I said, I mean, I was impacted by the negativity of language. We have doubled the number of people on anti-anxiety and antidepressant drugs in the last 10 years. Right? 1 in 5 Aussies is on an antidepressant or an anti-anxiety drug. And it must have something to do with that news, where, may I use a swear word? Where you think the world is going to shit, as opposed to getting better. And a great book to read is a book by a Swedish doctor, Rosling, called Factfulness. And certainly at our table, it's come with a strong recommendation. Do you want to just tell people, you learnt about it at school already, I think.
I heard about him when I was in high school because my teacher was a big fan.
Yeah, go tell us why it's good.
Then a few years later, I read an article. Bill Gates was also recommending everyone to read this book as well. It's actually using the stats to tell people the whole planet is actually getting better and better. We should always be more optimistic about what's happening here.
Steven Pinker at Harvard says anyone who can remember the good old days has got a bad memory. You know, 100 years ago, 1 in 5 women died in childbirth. 1 in 5 children died before the age of 5. And the work you've done in polio and malaria, that's part of the solution. So Bruce, it's less news, It's more interesting stuff. It's using alerts. It's using all the stuff to get, and it's telling more stories. So the Rotary stories, you know, get around Rotary. They don't get enough out to the rest of the world because what you're doing is world changing for the better. Well, not unless unless you know Melbourne has won.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Please, next person.
Oh, sorry, can I hear it from them or can I go back?
Yeah, just a question. You're talking about becoming optimistic. My background and career is in psychology. One of the fundamentals of human personality is you're an introvert or extrovert, you're an optimist or pessimist. There's neurophysiological evidence and brain evidence that pessimism and optimism is hardwired. Putting all that aside, are you suggesting that for the wired-in pessimists, it doesn't matter that they're wired in, if they start to use these techniques, they become optimists?
Don't know whether they'll become optimists, but it's why I ask the question I ask. I don't ask, are you optimistic? I say, what makes you optimistic? I actually had a Rotary president out at Mount Macedon, not Western, Woodend branch. He wasn't pulling my leg. He said he was the last person as we went round the room asking what makes you optimistic. And he said, I'm a pessimist. And I said to him, but tell us something that makes you positive. And it was his grandkids. And he rang me 2 weeks later and he said, maybe I'm not a pessimist. So there is evidence that says optimism and pessimism may come from different parts of the brain. One of our members, Professor G from Deakin University, who is a molecular psychiatrist, says optimism is the evidence of dreams not yet realised. Think about that one. The more you think about that one, it's sheer genius. So the view is that 25% of optimism is hardwired. And in Australia, when we interview the 20,000, mindset is a key. When I did the Epworth Hospital last Monday, most of the nurses were actually not natural optimists. They were mindset, life experience. When I did it out in a farming community out in West Wimmera, it was nearly 60% natural optimists. So again, it depends on a bit of genetics, conditioning, but particularly in the nursing profession, it's a mindset decision. And you know, you're an expert on this stuff. You know, if you're around a board asking people what keeps you awake at night, you're going to have misery. If instead you say what makes you optimistic about yourself or the enterprise, you are more likely, as Robert said, to see opportunity or positive risk rather than negative risk or minimising risk. So it's a really interesting question. I interviewed Martin Seligman. Those of you who believe in God, it was a funny thing. I got this phone call from Brazil. Someone said, oh, Vic, I was talking to Martin Seligman and I told him about what you're doing and he said he'd love to talk to you. And so I sent an email to his office and no response. And 2 weeks later, who should be walking up a corridor towards me was Martin Seligman and his wife. And I said, look, I don't want to bother you. You're obviously travelling. And I sent an email. I said, oh, you'll never get past my secretary. Come and have a coffee now. And I interviewed him on what makes him optimistic. And he said, I've nailed 40 years of research in that question. Because he then talked about personal, the change in the profession and the change in the world. Anyone who goes to my Twitter account, if you want to see the God's gift to positive psychology, he's up the top of my Twitter feed answering exactly that question, what makes you optimistic? And, you know, Mr. President, if we can do this again in a year's time, I won't actually speak. We'll actually go around the room asking everyone what makes them optimistic. So if your speaker organiser for next year thinks, let's have 50 Rotarians speak, we'll actually turn the tables and all of you will speak. So I think we've got time for one more question.
Very quickly, Peter Hollingworth. There are two questions wrapped into one. Your tie reminds me that colour has an important impact upon how we feel. And I believe that's true. Well, I was walking up to Rotary last week. I have my late wife's pink walking stick, which I need because I've had a number of falls and I'm under great risk. Anyway, two young women aged about 18 came past me and they looked at me and smiled and they said, we love the walking stick. it matches your suit. The other one was, and this is the real thing about the use of language. There was a great man who's still going. His name is a Roman Catholic Franciscan living in the deserts of the United States. His name is Richard Rohr. And he wrote a book and it's called Falling Upwards. And I thought, wow, well, I was feeling pretty down at one stage. And I thought, that's it. So when anyone says to you, how are you doing? I always say, I'm falling upwards.
Peter, when you were going through that crisis, you were in a restaurant in East Melbourne, and I was there celebrating an honour with my former mother-in-law. And even though you were under great pressure, you were so gracious. We took a photo with you, and I just remember in the midst of your pain, that you were both caring and cheerful and smiling. Richard Rohr, in fact, declares himself a radical optimist. This Catholic theologian, worth reading. So he, in fact, as you know, from the Anglican tradition, that belief that good things will happen and that things will work out in the end is so powerful. And then colour. Tommy Hilfiger, when he visited Melbourne last year, said that Melbourne women wear too much black. That a touch of yellow or orange or hot pink, colour is enormously influential, Peter, and I drive an orange Jeep. My cards are orange and yellow. That touch of colour, even if you're wearing a suit, I normally, even if I'm wearing this sort of darker suit, I have orange spectacles in the pocket. And one of the funniest things happened to me, I gave a speech in Phoenix to an audience of 600. And sometimes you get butterflies in your stomach when you've got to give a speech. I've never felt more nervous than going to an American audience in Phoenix and lecturing them on optimism. And this Polish woman in the audience said to me, Victor, every time I see you on television, you are wearing orange blazer, and here you are wearing dark suit. So she was the ultimate critic on that. But can I share the conclusion of that speech, Peter? The end of that speech, this tall black lady got up and she said, I'm born in Nigeria in the time of war, the Biafran War. And she says, my name means the future is better. I'm with you, Victor. And of course, the American audience cheered. And then this small woman, blonde, got up and said, my name is Hope, and I'm with you, Victor. You could not have scripted it better, Peter. So you've nailed it. I think, you have been such a community leader. You've gone through crisis, and beyond that crisis, you have been a great leader, smiling at everyone, talking at everyone, and you are one of my icon examples of people who are optimists, optimistic, and infectiously optimistic. And would you please join me in applauding him? Now, I think the time has come, the walrus said, for you all to do laughter yoga. No, you can't go.
Before we do the laughter yoga, I need one more minute. Phil Andersby, can you come up here with me, because I'm going off script.
Oh.
What a surprise. Now, Phil Andersby, as well as being a wonderful member of our club, has been designing these wonderful wilderness socks that are locally made here, just outside of Melbourne in Preston. I think these are them. So we're going to give you a lovely gift, Victor, that celebrates the upcoming convention and is also locally designed and made by Phil here. So Phil is actually going to present the wee gift to you, handmade and hand-delivered to you as a wonderful gesture of thanks to you for a lovely afternoon. Getting us all focused, so thank you very much.
I know we're in a rush, so I'm going to rush. I put a pair of bushwalking socks in there for Victor because I thought this might be very optimistic for him to say, hang on, I'm going to get out and start running around the track. So there you go.